Checks and balances is a system of overlapping powers. Now, in the previous video tutorial, we talked about separation of powers. And separation of powers is exactly what it sounds like, the separation of functions of government into different branches, and the branches can only perform their own assigned functions, not the functions of the other branches. Many times, quite often in fact, people talk about checks and balances and separation of powers interchangeably as if they're the same thing, when in reality they're different concepts, but they're complementary, and they reinforce one another. So the checks and balances as a system of overlapping powers does in fact allow branches to involve themselves in the behavior of other branches. It does not allow them to perform the other branch's function, but it does allow them some oversight, some involvement, allows them to check up on, essentially another branch, in order to ensure that that branch is not violating the law, acting unconstitutionally, concentrating power, what have you. One of the purposes of separation of powers and checks and balances is to guard against a concentration of power, right? That there is a need to fragment power and guard against concentrated power so that no one person, group, party, branch accumulates too much power. The way the government is structured is to decentralize, to diffuse power at multiple levels. So checks and balances allows, once again, branches to involve themselves in another branch's behavior without performing that other branch's function, so to speak. Okay. Now, for example, we know the quintessential example, I should say, is how we fill in this country a vacancy on the United States Supreme Court. So in this chart in front of you, it shows arrows overlapping and going in different directions. If there is a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court where there are currently 9 members of the Supreme Court, 9 seats, if someone retires or passes away, the judicial branch is not allowed to fill its own vacancy. The Supreme Court is filled with people that I'm sure have friends and colleagues that they think would be very good for that vacancy. But they are not allowed to nominate nor authorize someone to sit on the Supreme Court. Rather, that is the job of the presidency. The president nominates someone to fill that position. And so that is what we call a check on the judiciary. If you think about what it means, what the term check means, think about the game of chess. Okay, chess is often used in political terms because it describes international relations or political affairs, because there's so many different types of players with different levels of power and so forth. So chess is quite often a metaphor for power, international relations, politics, and what have you. In this case, we're going to use it as a metaphor or an analogy of power. When someone plays chess and someone says check, what that means is that the king is in jeopardy, that someone has direct power over you. They have a direct line of influence over you. And unless you move the king, you're going to lose. Okay? So check is about having influence on someone else, having some power and some control. So checks and balances, having some power and control over one another so that there's balance in the system. By allowing, in our example, the president to nominate a vacancy on the Supreme Court, there is a certain degree of power and control over the judiciary. Okay, and the presidency can nominate someone, but we know that that nominee does not take any active functioning role in the judiciary until Congress, specifically the Senate, approves of the presidential nomination. So, in fact, there are multiple checks and balances at play in how we nominate someone to the Supreme Court. Congress, the Senate, must approve of a presidential nomination. That is a check on the presidency, and that is a check on the judiciary, both. So Congress has multiple checks on the filling of a Supreme Court vacancy. Now, when the president nominates someone, in all likelihood, they're going to nominate someone that shares his or her political and legal ideology. This is an enormous amount of power. And currently, many people think it's the most important aspect of presidential power because, for example, George W. Bush nominated Justice Alito and Justice Roberts to the Supreme Court. George W. Bush is no longer president, but Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts will be there for the next 20 years shaping public policy and legal policy in the United States. So that's an enormous amount of power the president has. And the reason they'll be there so long in the Supreme Court is they're nominated for life. And so because the judiciary is not answerable to the public through direct elections, it is the legal wing. They are appointed. It is very important that the nominees are scrutinized. Now, currently, that scrutiny that is applied through congressional hearings, Senate hearings, and so forth is quite often insufficient in many people's minds. It does not necessarily play out in a manner that is best suits society. Rather, it's a political battle between the parties of whether or not they're going to accept the president's nominee and so forth. But because they're appointed for life, because the presidency has influence to shape the ideological outlook of the court, which is a separate branch from the presidency, we do not, as a society, let the president nominate and then be done with it. We allow the Senate to review the presidential nomination to make sure that the person is either qualified, faithful to the law, ensuring that they're not somehow or another going to have a political agenda. And of course, many of these things happen no matter what. Members of the Supreme Court are political. They're human beings. And a lot of these things that we're trying to guard against happen in spite of our best efforts or how the system is set up. Nevertheless, this is the point of the system, is to guard against these types of abuses. So Congress can approve, meaning the Senate can approve of that nominee, or they can reject it. If they reject it, the president then renominates someone again. This system of overlapping powers as it relates to the judiciary, just using this as an example of a vacancy on the Supreme Court, is a perfect example of checks and balances. Remember that the president and Congress, in having some power over who sits on the Supreme Court, they are not actually performing the function of the judiciary. They're merely allowed to involve themselves in how the judiciary conducts some of its business, how it's structured, who gets to sit on the judiciary, to ensure that there is balance of interest and that there is not an abuse of power. Now, the majority, well, I shouldn't say the majority, but a great deal of emphasis is placed on checks and balances as it relates to the presidency. And this is because there's so much concentrated power in the presidency in the 21st century, and there always has been, but even more so now with the accumulation of power, one person, that there is this need to make sure that that one person does not abuse his or her power. For all the branches, the point of checks and balances, beyond what has already been stated, is this, and that is merely because we separate the powers from one another and do not allow the different branches to perform one another's functions, does not mean that there still cannot be abuse internally within a branch, and that there cannot be inappropriate, unconstitutional behavior within a branch, or too much concentrated power. So the president, we know, looking at Nixon or other types of cases, if we look at President Nixon and the Watergate affair, there are many, many instances of abuse of power. And it is very important for the other branches to be able to intervene so that they can stop internal abuses of power inside branches other than their own. Okay, and of course, they have the power to self-regulate. The presidency can conduct reviews of behavior within their own branch and so forth, and that's true for Congress, etc. But checks and balances is a system of overlapping powers that reinforces the doctrine of separation of powers and tries to prevent abuses of power, unconstitutional behavior, and to essentially ensure that there's a decentralization of power and essentially balance in our government.